Hi everybody, if I could ask you to start taking your seats please, we'll just get started in a moment. Thank you. Such a quick reaction, that's great. Thank you. No, we'll just get started with some of the opening formalities. There will be more people kind of streaming in as we go through. So good evening to you all and welcome. My name is Rebecca Mikula-Wright. I'm the CEO of the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change and also CEO across the Investor Group on Climate Change that covers Australia and New Zealand. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight. I know there's a wall of activities on this week, so we're very lucky that we got you for this evening. And it's one of our first events that we've had since 2019 for obvious reasons over the last couple of years, and really glad that we could do this in Tokyo after a lot of requests from our members to have an in-person event. I would really like to thank MSCI for sponsoring this event on carbon pricing and looking forward to welcoming the speakers from MSCI shortly. So you can see, I think you saw the agenda up there before, very simple session, just some opening remarks from me. I'll hand over to Chitra Hepburn from MSCI, and then we'll get a context-setting presentation from Linda Ealing-Lee from MSCI as well, followed by the panel session and then dinner. And so please obviously get drinks along the way. It looks like you all have those. Hopefully there are some translator sets on the table if you would like them, so reminding myself to speak a little bit slower for anyone who is using those sets. This is the first of a number of AIGCC events that we're hosting across a couple of days. We weren't able to fit them all in on one day because of so many other things on. We do have a steel roundtable on tomorrow and an asset owner roundtable. And then we have the launch of our Japanese translation of a greenwashing guide with a foreword and a keynote by the Financial Services Agency of Japan on Wednesday morning, which is also open if you'd like to attend that. So just a little bit about AIGCC, for those of you who don't know us. So despite the restrictions over the last couple of years, we've grown quite significantly in terms of our membership. We're now over 70 members across 11 Asian markets, and we just celebrated our 7-year anniversary just in September, which was quite the milestone. We now have 20 staff spread across 7 markets, and some of the areas that we cover for our members that include asset owners, government pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, asset managers, and all members of the investment value chain that are across our membership from these 11 markets, and we do have some international members who are not based in the region as well. But some of our focus areas that we cover, we do have a Japan working group now for anyone who's based in Japan who'd like to get more involved in that, and that's chaired by Kawasaki-san from MUFG Asset Management. We now have a China working group that's chaired by Flora Wang from Fidelity and Dr. Pei-Wan Guo, founder of Sintao Green Finance and China SIF. And we have various other themes and working groups and a whole program of work that support those. Also new this year, forest and land use, which is a working group that's really taken off. Physical risk and resilience, and energy transition. Of course, we also have our Climate Action 100 Plus work and our corporate engagement work as well. So with the Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, we now cover 34 companies in Asia. And we also have the AIGCC Asia Utilities Engagement Program that covers 7 utilities across the 5 Asian markets. So we've also really increased our engagement with policymakers all across the region. And we're covering a range of topics from climate finance, energy transition, including sectoral transition pathways, climate disclosure, physical climate risks and adaptation planning. So if I could actually just ask the AIGCC team who are here to stand up, embarrass you a little bit, just so that you can just see who they are if you want to go and talk to them about any of your work. And yes, thank you, Sophia, and I would also like to introduce you to Sophia Cheng, the chair of AIGCC, who's also with us here today. So please go and talk to any of them about any of our programs if you'd like to know more about that. So on to today's session. So it's going to be a really promising one, and it's a really timely one actually, for Asia particularly, and given you, probably a lot of you saw the most recent IEA net zero emission report that was just released. unfortunately indicating their emissions are not on track to be aligned with net zero. However, what it does highlight is that 1.5 is still possible, but that path continues to narrow and get more difficult. And so this is bringing the focus on, how much we need these robust climate policies to really tighten climate action. Obviously, for Asia, this is particularly true. We have some of the biggest global manufacturing countries and companies, and the battle for climate will really be won or lost in Asia. So I can't stress enough how important it is to have this conversation, but also hopefully really to use all the events across the course of this week to really galvanise action that you are taking, your colleagues are taking, and really use these events not just for events, but to really learn, grow, brainstorm, so that we can actually really make some progress over the course of this week. And I think this is one of the powerful benefits of bringing, these very large group of international investors together. So please do use these opportunities and the dinner and all the conversations after to really forward your own agenda in your own organisation and really push yourselves in what you can do.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Anjali Vishwamohanan, Director of Policy with the Asia Investor Group on Climate Change. And I will take over now to kickstart our panel discussion on the topic of carbon pricing frameworks in Asia. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It was really great to have Rebecca, Chitra, and Linda kick us off with an excellent setup on the context for this discussion. As we've heard, we are at a critical juncture in terms of climate action and policy making to incentivize action, especially if there's an intention to remain on the 1.5-degree pathway. It's interesting to note that 2/3 of countries that have made climate commitments in the form of NDCs have mentioned that carbon pricing is a tool that they would adopt to achieve emission reduction targets. So when you look at that, that's about 100 countries, several of which are in Asia. From Linda's presentation, we saw that there are 6 markets in Asia that have already implemented some form of carbon pricing. This includes China, which implemented the carbon pricing mechanism for the power sector in 2020 and 2021, sorry. So that's touching its 2-year anniversary, and then Korea in 2015. So that's been about 8 years. Indonesia has just recently joined a mandatory ETS for its power sector. Singapore has a carbon tax in place as well. And so we see that there are several frameworks, including one that's been implemented in Japan under the GX framework as well. And all of these are projected to grow in terms of prices and also emissions coverage. Outside of Asia, we see that prices on European Union's emissions allowances reached a record high of 100 euros per metric ton of carbon dioxide in February 2023. Furthermore, the transition phase of the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism has just come into effect as of yesterday, with effects that the bloc's carbon price from 2026 will be applied to imported goods, including those from Asia. How does this affect carbon pricing frameworks in Asia, and how can businesses and financial sector be better prepared in terms of these frameworks? To discuss all of this, we have a fantastic lineup of panelists, and as I sort of call them, can I please request you to join me on stage? So first we have Sophia Cheng. Sophia is the Chief Investment Officer of Cathay Financial Holdings, and she's also the chair of AIGCC. We have Dr. Ben Caldecott, who is a member of the UK Climate Change Committee and also the founding director of the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group. We have Trista Chen, who is the head of Investment Stewardship Asia, excluding Japan, at LGIM. And we have Dr. Toshi Arimura, who is a professor of political science and economics and director of Research Institute for Environment, Economics, and Management at Waseda University. Please join me. Thank you so much for joining us during the session today. As you can see, I think there's a lot of interest in understanding more about carbon pricing frameworks, which are not discussed enough. And I'm really grateful to have all of you with us for this session today. I think, Ben, it'll be great to kickstart with you with the EU ETS being the longest standing carbon pricing system globally. So, I mean, it'll be just great to hear from you on how the EU ETS has evolved over time, and has it actually led to more transition, innovation, and funding for transition as well?
Yes, great, and thank you for having me, and wonderful to be on this panel to investigate, talk about these really important issues for the world, but also for the region. So one of the questions I was given, and I'll come to your EU ETS question at the end of what I wanted to say, was around how effective carbon pricing has been as a policy tool to tackle the transition around the world. And I think there are a couple of ways of answering that question, which is a really important question. And the first is, what do we mean by carbon pricing? So everyone's been using the word carbon pricing so far. We haven't really defined it yet, and I think we ought to define it. I think I know where everyone's coming from, and I think we'll get there. But I just wanted to be clear about what we mean. So obviously there are emissions trading schemes. There are different compliance schemes. The EU ETS is one of them. There's the voluntary carbon market. There are obviously carbon taxes of different forms that are introduced in different ways around the world. There's that debate between ETSs and carbon taxes. Well, we can talk about that. There are implied carbon prices, which are actually, I'll say more about this, probably the most important, actually, in terms of, so far anyway, in terms of driving the transition. So those are the carbon prices that are essentially you could impute or calculate on the basis of regulations and other taxes that have been introduced. They're not necessarily explicitly about pricing carbon, but they in effect price carbon. There's the social cost of carbon, and governments using that and other stakeholders using that to price emissions. So sort of essentially an internal carbon price, but for policymakers and regulators around the world, and different governments have different views on what the appropriate social cost of carbon should be and how that should change over time. And sometimes that's dependent on changes in government and what those governments think about climate change. And then what was talked about at the beginning around the internal carbon pricing and how that's introduced. And in each of those buckets, there are lots of different ways of doing this. And I think one theme that I hope we draw out through the conversation is that there's no single right answer. You need some combination of all of the above to achieve outcomes. So let's just be clear and let's also just be clear about what we're talking about when we're talking about carbon pricing. So the other part of the question is around effectiveness. How are we defining the effectiveness of carbon pricing? What does that even mean? Is it about motivating new capex-intensive investments in low-carbon infrastructure? Is that what we mean by effectiveness? Is it about improving energy efficiency and resource efficiency? Is it a tech-neutral way of allocating capital across society? That was one of the main arguments for going with cap and trade over carbon taxes and other policy mechanisms. Is it a way of raising revenue for governments, for example, through auctions? Which sectors are we talking about? Which jurisdictions are we talking about? How quickly? Pace is key, obviously, to achieve net zero. What choices and decisions are we trying to influence through carbon pricing? Or is it all of the above? And it clearly is all of the above in some sense. Now, in terms of has carbon pricing being an effective policy tool globally, actually the track record's been pretty poor. And the biggest things that have happened, which are no way sufficient to deal with the climate crisis, have generally been dealt with other policy instruments. So coal phase out, that's been, in jurisdictions where that's happened, that's often been introduced through things like emissions performance standards. For example, it hasn't really been the carbon price, although it has helped at the margin. We can come back to that. Deforestation, the policies that have, to the extent that they have worked in some places that have stopped or reduced the rate of deforestation, have had nothing really to do with REDD+ or carbon markets. They're down to dealing with issues of corruption, for example, and other policy interventions, and you see this in Brazil at the moment. Electric vehicles, that's about innovation, but it's also about tax rebates when you buy an electric vehicle and other policy incentives, not necessarily about a carbon price. And then when we look at the energy transition and the deployment of renewables, again, we're looking at feed-in tariffs, and we're looking at contracts for difference, and we're looking at tradable renewable energy certificates and things like that. We're not really talking about the carbon price. So we're starting from not a great place actually in terms of how carbon pricing, even if you define it in the broad way that I did at the beginning, these different buckets, not just an ETS. We're not at a great place in terms of what it's actually done. That's not to say that it won't play a really important role and can play a really important role, but we need, again, this sort of theme of a blend of different approaches selected based on the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Now, I take it that we're mainly talking about emissions trading, so I should have just cut to the chase, but again, I wanted us to be clear about what we're talking about. ETS and effectiveness. So, and to your point about the EU ETS, what's it been good at so far? It's been pretty good at doing marginal change in obviously the sectors that it's covered. So it's been quite good at coal to gas switching in certain periods. Certain periods it's also been quite good at supporting biomass conversion in Europe. And those are important things, but it has been not very useful for driving big capex intensive investments. So the offshore wind farms that you see in the North Sea are not, the investments case is not based on the carbon price or the EU ETS price. Now, could that change? I'm sure it could change. The price is much higher than it's been, as was said. It could be higher for longer. There are instruments that can be built on top of carbon markets to provide investors with certainty. We can talk more about what those could be. And then obviously the CBAMs as well help to internationalize the impact of the EU ETS. And I think determinations around equivalency in the EU context will be very important. Are your carbon prices, is your ETS in the exporting jurisdiction equivalent to the importing, or to that in the EU ETS, and that determination will be really important. And if it happens, it'll happen at a jurisdictional level, but you could also imagine, I think, those sorts of determinations may be happening at a company level. If you have a credible transition plan as an exporter in Asia, will you have better access to the European market, potentially? Yes, I think that will happen eventually. I think we need to focus much more on the investability and bankability of the carbon price, not just how high the price is. So when there was that great MSCI slide looking at the different carbon prices in the different tradable schemes, you can't really compare them because some of those prices will be much more volatile in some markets than others. There'll be policy uncertainty or certainty. And really the key thing for making the change happen in the real economy is the investability and bankability of the carbon price, and that's driven by consistency, predictability, the stability of policy frameworks. And you just have to look at, for example, in the EU case, comparing that with some other jurisdictions that have tried to introduce carbon prices and through emissions trading and have completely failed and had to backtrack. So Canada, I'm thinking, and also Australia. And two other things before finishing. So one is we also need to think about how we use the prices to shift behavior. So traditionally people have thought about, well, we set the price low and steadily it rises. Actually, that's not a great way of shocking the system into making a big change. You probably want the price to be quite high initially to get everyone to kind of wake up and start changing their behavior and then reduce it over time. That's quite a different approach conceptually. And maybe that's something, particularly in Asia, jurisdictions that are introducing these things, actually that's something that they could think a bit more about. And then finally, the future of all of this, I think one area where cap and trade, emissions trading can play a really important role is actually in carbon removals. And so making sure we actually have negative targets within emissions trading schemes and that high quality carbon removal offsets are allowed for compliance purposes, that could help to create the price signal, the economic signal that we need to really scale up carbon removals around the world. So I will stop there.
Great. I think we've stopped at a good point to sort of bring Professor Arimura in. So just to sort of give more context, Professor Arimura has served on a number of Japanese government committees on environmental issues, including committees on carbon pricing and emissions trading schemes in Japan. He has also served on local government advisory committees on emission trading schemes in both Tokyo and Saitama, which was mentioned in Linda's presentation earlier. So I think just turning to you, Professor Arimura, I was just wondering if you might be able to sort of provide us with a view on developments that's happened more recently in Japan, both under the Tokyo and the Saitama trading systems, and then also the GX as well.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Actually, I'm currently living in Paris, but I happen to be in Tokyo for an academic conference that I'm being the president, so I was so lucky to be part of this event. So before introducing the recent developments back this, but I want to share with you the developments, local ETS in Japan. So I was involved in the design of Tokyo ETS and Saitama ETS. And just like Ben mentioned, actually Tokyo ETS initially had high price, close to $100, and which effectively, I think, induced innovations. So in my research, I found that lots of regulated entities, like actually this building, Roppongi Hills, installed energy efficient technologies. And consequently, they reduced a lot. Then they banked a lot of permits, which led to the very low current price. That's why we have a low price. And at nationwide, we have a very small carbon tax, less than $2. But the government is using that revenue to promote energy efficiencies and to support renewables. And until 2020, we had no serious discussion of carbon pricing at the nationwide. But after the announcement of carbon neutrality, the government changed their view on climate change issues. Until then, they looked at the climate change as a cost for the economy. But now they view it as an opportunity, and they call it green transformations. It's a great opportunity for Japanese economy to transform, to have economic growth and green environmental conservation. So the government is promoting carbon pricing that can contribute to economic growth. So this is what the government is trying to do. So the government started to issue a green transformation bond, GX bond, to support innovation for energy-intensive sectors. And from this year, 2023, we started the voluntary emission trading scheme called GX ETS, which covers from 2023 to 25. And so far, more than 600 companies actually signed up this voluntary scheme, which covers more than 40% of Japanese carbon emissions. And interestingly, Prime Minister announced in the press conference at the United Nations that by 2033, we will have auction of permits to the power sectors. So we will have mandatory ETS, latest by the 2033. In between, we still do not know what will be happening. So we will be discussing the transition from voluntary to mandatory ETS. And in addition, actually the government is now adding a carbon levy, which will start in 2028. But the government has not announced the amount, the size of the revenue, the price. But we know that since the government is issuing this GX bond, they have to pay back these bonds from this revenue from tax and auctions. So this is I think the major developments in the Japanese government. And to support this development, actually the government is helping Tokyo Stock Exchange. So Tokyo Stock Exchange had a trial of carbon markets or voluntary domestic credit called J credits. So we have a voluntary offset scheme that people can generate credits from energy efficiency or renewables or forest conservations. And from this month, actually Tokyo Stock Exchange will have an official carbon market exchange. And so far only this J credits will be, I think, traded, but I'm sure that they want to expand this market to have a more variety of carbon credits. Okay, I think that's the development we are having now.
Thank you. Just, I think it'll be interesting to turn to you right now, because as a global investor that operates across multiple markets, including EU and Asia, your perspectives on this would be quite valuable. So, how do you see the role of various carbon pricing instruments, both in Asian markets, playing out based on things that's happening in Europe, such as CBAM? Is this an opportunity for Asian policymakers and sort of companies to step up on carbon pricing mechanisms, as we heard earlier? And how are global investors viewing these approaches to carbon pricing as well?
Thank you, Anjali. I'm glad to be here today. So LGM actually published a climate scenario paper earlier this year. And for those of you who might have come across the paper, we actually summarized one key topic that we're talking about here, that the power of carbon price. So my colleague Nick in the UK, who is the author of the paper, actually summarized that the biggest policy lever available to help us to guide the transition and drive real change is carbon pricing. However, as we have heard from various speakers, that this tool is underused. He actually proposed, if in a very ideal case, we are able to achieve a global, meaningful, consistent pricing market that are able to incorporate into investment decision and drive changes. So I think that would be a really ideal situation if we're able to have. But coming back to the reality, if we have heard from various speakers about what carbon price is and how the policy can actually drive changes, we also can hear from the other side of the conversation, which is almost like company responding to that, right? So as a company, when we engage with our investee companies, they will be subject to the policy requirement in different markets they operate, may it be carbon tax or the ETS. But then on the other hand, they are also reporting through disclosure framework, namely TCFD. And if you bring the TCFD angle into Asia, it is not uncommon, and I think most of you in the room will be quite familiar with how TCFD is well recognized in the Asia stock exchange market. So just to name the number of stock exchanges that have referenced TCFD in their ESG disclosure guideline, that include Japan, Hong Kong Stock Exchange, Singapore, Malaysia, India, and Taiwan. And then the ones that have openly mentioned they will support, including a number of ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and also Korea. So what does that mean for companies? On the other hand, on one hand, when they conduct their reporting referencing TCFD, who has clearly mentioned that internal carbon pricing should be used as one of the tools that incorporate into scenario analysis and come to the right decision for making investments, looking into the future. Why should they put into a technology R&D effort into a commercial sense that to be realized in the future, and carbon pricing is effective tool. But on the other hand, in the absence of a reliable or sophisticated policy framework, and also when the policy framework with the average pricing is only, I think, globally $6, benchmarking the price that was mentioned in COP27, that should be $75. There's like 12% gaps where company will need to say, which number should I adopt to be the most effective one in my making business decision, right? So those are the questions that we as a major institutional investor often face when we have the conversation with our invested company when we talk about carbon price. So on one hand, we are encouraging company to referencing global framework, including the upcoming TPT that is announcing next week, with the final framework coming out, using that to set the strategy commitment at the company level to say that what are we committing as a company as a whole in net zero. The second thing is using TCFD framework to identify the risk and opportunity and doing sufficient scenario analysis using, for example, the tool of internal carbon pricing and support it with science-based target in the, using the science to support the decision making. So you see the tier structure that a company will go through. But without a sufficient policy in place to support company to make this decision, we're sort of in a limbo position. So as an investor, we engage both on the policy side and also on the invested company to motivate them, to nudge them. And we do see, even in Asia, I think just in the last 3 weeks, I had, I think 10 conversations with various invested companies, including Korea, China, Singapore, and India. And out of the 10, at least half of them mentioned to us that they adopt internal carbon pricing as their investment decision. One of the Korean company, actually, I asked that why would you support the hydrogen as potential transition? What about the financial return? And then the answer is that we have been using internal carbon pricing, and they used $100. So I said, wow, that's pretty advanced comparing to where the Korean ETS is doing. And they said, yes, because this is no longer optional for us we must find a way to reflect this and gain business decision making, right? On the other hand, another company I've spoken to in the emerging market, they said we are not in a position to discuss that because we're subject to ETS, but then we are seriously considering what that means in terms of our carbon asset or our carbon liability, because their emission will be subject to trading, right? So I would say while we are hoping for more global or regional aligned policy to come out on this important topic, as an investor, we would want to see market is moving while the policy is sorting it out. So we would not be able to wait for the policy to be finalized and aligned, and then the market to react. So that's pretty much where I see the risk and opportunity.
Sophia, do you have more to sort of add to this discussion around sort of best practices for companies based on your engagements with them and how you've been sort of engaging with them on this specific topic?
Okay, thank you. I'm very honored to work with Rebecca and the team, and thank you so much today for being here. It's very, very so happy that after years we can finally gather in person. Cathay Financial Holdings is the largest financial group in Taiwan, and we have total asset around $400 billion US. And very luckily in 2016 we joined AIGCC, and we've been very, very active in engagement. And we are a member of, we participate in Climate Action 100+, CDP non-disclosure campaign, and also Asia Utility Engagement Program. We believe only by participating in international initiative, learning by doing and doing by learning, we can really find out what is the reason for corporate doing it or not doing it. So when Anjali asked about Asia companies, how we see the opportunity, I think it's very hard to use Asia because every country in Asia is so different. They are different, their net zero transition, the speed and the form, the way they do it are different. The economic characteristic is different. Concentration of market share is different. For example, in Taiwan, we have so many SMEs, more than 90% of corporates, where in some countries they have more conglomerates. That's way easier to push on the corporate decision. The structure of energy source is also different. Taiwan, Korea, Japan depends on energy import. Take Taiwan as example, we import 98% of our energy, and therefore the speed and the availability for tool are also different. And lastly, corporate awareness, capability, and capacity are also different. Asia is a very important supply chain for the world. For example, the iPhone you use, the assembler, the maker is Foxconn Group, Hon Hai. The gross margin is 5%, but Apple Computer gross margin is 50%. So once your gross margin in Asia is quite low, when we adopt any carbon pricing, that means the supply chain with lower margin company could be more affected in their P&L statement. And therefore, it's very important we adopt earlier, encourage them to do simulation for future. And the motivation for net zero transition is also different, especially in Asia. Every year, different countries have election. It can become political when they decide the carbon pricing. Having said that, today, we already have 19 countries who commit to net zero or carbon neutrality. So that is pretty good, and especially Japan, Korea, and Taiwan already have this in law. And the local regulators are very, very active in tightening the rule in ESG disclosure, green product definition, and so the net zero transition is on the way. And when we look into the guide by the world, including Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, the principle they were talking about, some important principle, very important when we adopt carbon pricing. For example, we need to have legal binding, which is in line with science-based evidence. We also, very importantly, need to have long-term predictable pricing, This will allow corporate to incorporate into their budget and long-term planning. Otherwise, they keep debating and complain to the government. It's too difficult. So with a very clear eventual pricing in hand, we can give very big discount at the beginning and narrow the discount. Corporate know they should do it earlier than later. And then we also, this mechanism can force company to formalize the environmental cost into their operation. Do you pay or do you change? Do you want to earn money? Do you want to earn respect? Or do you want to earn both? If you do it early, I think both is possible. And lastly, I do see that governments are competing. They are facing a lot of pressure. They need to increase the carbon pricing. Singapore has already raised the price. And I think more countries, including Taiwan, is also doing that. And allow me to give some example on corporates, as Anjali just mentioned. For my group, Cathay Life, we have internal pricing. We already adopted every department. If you save the electricity, half of the cost you save a company go into a budget for the department. Where we have used MSCI, today you are also here, we use the CVAR to calculate, and in which we assume $200 US by 2030. And we also focus on high emitters. If they don't have very good transition plan, they will be on the top of our list. We need to do engagement. You need to write a report and tell me your engagement plan before you do the investment. And the bank also do the calculation for the emission of their company, assuming $10, $20 to $100 US. At what level this company will become break-even after they charge the carbon tax? Then we will talk to the company, what do you plan to do? Because they will affect your default risk when I grant you a loan. So try to make the science, basic math already work. And one of the company in Taiwan called Delta Electronics, they actually apply $300 US in their internal pricing. And the department really deducted from their annual budget and performance. And they will affect their annual bonus and compensation. They do put this money into a big pool to nurture new low carbon project, and that make this company very leading in low carbon solutions. So we already see more and more cases to make it work, and corporate do show that they do this, they put the investment, their share price doesn't go down. So if we put more effort and all the investors working together to direct the money, have better filter to this company with greater ambition, I think we are really creating impact to them.
So I think, Ben, what we're sort of hearing from the investors on the panel is that they're engaging with companies on carbon pricing, and there are some good examples of companies setting internal targets on shadow pricing and all of that. So and we also heard from the presentation earlier that the carbon pricing really needs to step up from the government side. But how do governments, especially in Asia, do that? I think one of the biggest risks that governments are sort of thinking about is stranded assets and financial instability. So how do you sort of overcome this to achieve the levels of carbon pricing that we need to see in different markets?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I think the way I would view the introduction of carbon pricing policies and instruments is a way of avoiding stranded assets, actually not about creating them. It's about preventing the misallocation of capital, the allocation of capital to things that could then become stranded. And so the sooner you introduce appropriately designed carbon pricing instruments and mechanisms and policies, the less likely you are to suffer from stranded assets. So that's one thing to say, and the other, of course, is that the reality is, as I was saying at the beginning, is that it's not just all about the carbon pricing. It's there are a whole bunch of different things that are at play. Technological innovation, changing consumer preferences, litigation of different kinds in different jurisdictions. That will drive change and result in assets being stranded in different sectors and just different geographies. And to a degree, that's creative destruction. We're going to see that in every economy over time, and that's something that societies have to deal with. And so that, I think, is something that companies need to think about a bit. It depends on the sector, really, but I do think governments need to think more about this and be very proactive, and that's where the conversations around the just transition are really important. How as a government can you support a just transition? How can you mitigate these political economy frictions? And we shouldn't kind of pretend those don't exist. We should be very explicit about those things and come up with appropriate interventions to mitigate those consequences. And let's not forget that to achieve net zero and the aims of the Paris Agreement, we are talking about decarbonising the entire global economy in less than 30 years. And so there are going to be a lot of stranded assets. But as I say, I think carbon pricing is a way of actually reducing the amount of stranded assets that will exist.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can add some point to the stranded asset. It's actually very serious problem for investors, because when about 2 years ago, I started to see there's a bigger and bigger pressure, not just on divest on coal, but also on overall fossil fuel. And as I said earlier, for every country, their challenge is so different. But it's really worthwhile when you go to your investee company, tell them you may become stranded asset. They get serious about that because it's so easy. How many tons of emission times potential carbon tax or levy? And this means 30-40% of your earnings will be gone. So what do you think about this? All the companies care about their share price more than us, and they care about their future more than us. So this will trigger them to think more on improving disclosure. And they will tell you 200 projects they are doing, but all you care is asking them, okay, what does that mean? All this together, are you going to cut your emission by 40% by 2030? And you start to, So and now they realize they cannot tell you many works they are doing. They need to quantify all the effort. What does that mean to their emission? And they need to think about if they don't want to pay the carbon pricing, they got to do something. And at the end of the day, we don't want this company to disappear. We want them to transform. Because we still need building material, we still need glass, we still need the steel. But can they change the way they made the production? And some of the industrial company, they do need longer time to changing their future way of production in technology innovation. So the labeling potential risk of stranded asset really make them take it a lot more serious than before.
Professor Arimura, when we were sort of thinking about how carbon pricing is evolving from Europe, one of the interesting concepts that came out of the G7 discussions was on sort of climate clubs, where you're aligning or bringing more linkages among carbon market systems globally. And so you're seeing this conversation amongst the G7 countries, and I know you've done a lot of work around carbon market linkages for Asia. So how do you sort of see this playing out for Asia? How can it be done? What are the benefits? Anything around that you can sort of provide insight on?
Thank you. Climate Club is a very interesting idea to promote climate change issues, but I think it's kind of idea that is promoted by European countries. So Japanese government may not so much into the discussion of Climate Club. I guess that may be a situation here in Japan. But regarding the carbon markets in Asia, actually, Chinese government is really interested in linking their ETS to the Korea and Japan. So I have been attending the carbon pricing forum among the Japanese government and Chinese government and the Korean government since 2016. And unfortunately, in Japan, we don't have a national carbon market, so we have nothing to link. And the Tokyo ETS has been forbidding to use of the international credits. So far from the Japanese side, we have nothing to link. But maybe after the development of GX ETS, we have some concrete emission trading schemes that we can link to this international market. So that's, I think, one possibility that we can have in Asia. And in addition, Singapore is very active in the carbon credits, and because of the influence of the EU CBAM, more and more Asian countries seriously considering carbon pricing. And I'm sure that some countries, in addition to Indonesia, will implement some form of ETS. So that may be another possibility for future integration in Asia.
If I can add, one of the consideration we need to realize that despite different countries' carbon credit system may not be materialized yet, this is actually a cross-boundary situation. So any company that would have cross-boundary value chain, either supply and demand, they may be facing the carbon pricing issue as a potential trade barrier, let's say CBAM being effective as of yesterday. But they also need to realize that when companies make decisions, let's say a Korean headquarter company where they have footprint in US, Europe, and Singapore, Indonesia, the decision of carbon pricing need to be reflecting not just where they operate. So in the situation, let's say Japan, Korea, and China, what would be the effective investment decision the company internal to make, reflecting their expansion footprint into the global market, and then also their supply chain in X amount of countries that would be subjecting potential tax onto their not just operation, but products, right? So that's where, while we talk about what would be effective carbon price within the country itself, we have to encourage companies to think holistically and then do the proper assessment analysis to say that in your own operation, global footprint, including potential business expansion strategy, or even your divestment strategy, what would be the carbon pricing that you need to consider? And that's where a lot of conversation that we realize with invested company, they're not actively, proactively thinking of that, and that can be potential really hurting them on the share price, because this is where, in the event of lack of consideration, it will happen, right? It's already happening. I think we can't, again, it's getting too late for us to act on the overall climate change situation, so we must take that action into consideration.
I think we are sort of edging towards the close of the session, and so before that, I'd like to give the audience a chance to ask our brilliant panelists who are able to offer, their expertise from both an investor side, recommendations from policymakers, from the academia. So I'd just like to check if there are any questions from the audience that we can pose to the panel. I think so. Tom? Vic, can you pass a mic?
In terms of mandatory carbon pricing schemes, in particular emissions trading schemes, in a lot of Western markets that went early, you saw a lot of community resistance against them. In particular, the cost pass-through to utility costs, and also industry, I guess, resistance as well. Probably no surprise you can hear my Australian accent, so we obviously had a pretty willing experience with that, but that's also been an experience in Canada and other markets as well. And in terms of markets where they've sought to reform or put more teeth into existing schemes to tighten liabilities, tighten caps. So I'm just wondering how the panel feels that might play out in Asia as Asia starts to lean towards carbon pricing mechanisms in kind of more mandatory settings or in more expanded settings, whether you think you might see that same kinds of resistance in either communities or industry sectors, and how they might be navigated or, I guess, preempted as we go down that path.
I think it would be good to sort of get an approach both from an investor perspective and also experiences that's already sort of happened in Europe, and how governments are sort of dealing with this issue.
Well, I'm happy to have a crack. I mean, I think the examples you gave are countries that produce fossil fuels, and I think the political challenges in those jurisdictions are particularly acute. A lot of Asian countries are importers of energy, although not all, obviously. And I think, it's not going to be easy. So there's going to be political opposition at a local level, at a national level, and that's going to manifest itself in all sorts of different ways through the matrix of national context. And we shouldn't ignore those. We should be aware of them, we should be upfront about them, and we should proactively think about how we manage them. I think one of the things that's really annoyed me over the last 15 years or so, well, since Copenhagen really, is Copenhagen had this sort of nickname as Hopenhagen. Everyone was sort of, this 2009, and this was going to be the big climate COP that was going to save the world, and no one was talking about the downside risk, no one was talking about stranded assets, everyone was going to be a winner. This is an incredibly complicated transition. We need to be upfront about the stranded assets, the just transition, and not lie to people. And you're already seeing the politics getting trickier. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be really difficult. So that's maybe not what some people want to hear, but we've got to be open about that and deal with it appropriately.
Trista and then Sophia. Oh, Sophia, you want to go ahead?
I think in Asia, because the overall is many of these countries are emerging countries, they are growing their economy. And in early stage, it's very tough for them to say, you should stop your growth, because once you grow, you will have to consume more energy. So it takes longer time for the debate. And obviously, because once there's a resistance, you'll be very slow, because you got elections, you got political campaign. But I think when we see Asian countries in Southeast Asia already work on taxonomy, the second edition, where China, Taiwan also have taxonomy, it may work if we have Asian countries and markets work together, because what you care is if you move faster and someone else don't, and you lose your market share, given that it's not really mandatory globally, the export competitiveness is very important. So I'm actually quite positive once we have the taxonomies in place in all the countries, you have a very good standard. This is a minimum benchmark for you to do, and with that, they can start to assign quota the emission by sector. So if I think from maybe 2 years from now, we should be seeing some acceleration trend. It's my current assumption. And 2 years from now is already 2025. We need to answer what have we done for 2025 target, and how far are we from 2030 targets.
So just one quick thing to add. I do think this also speaks to the need to act as companies and financial institutions and not wait for government, right? So this is sort of where transition plans, credible transition plans, and credible transition planning become really important. And investors have a role to play in making sure their investee companies have those credible transition plans. And obviously a credible transition plan should talk about the just transition, as well as how preparers of those plans are going to support decarbonisation in the countries in which they operate. And a little plug that you referenced was the publication of this Transition Plan Task Force Disclosure Framework that's coming out on Monday, that will set out a gold standard best practice way of doing transition plans and reporting. And that framework is designed to be adopted internationally and can be adopted straight away. In Asia, in Japan, the JFSA has been very engaged in the work that we've been doing. MAS in Singapore has been a formal observer to the Transition Plan Task Force. I co-head the secretariat of the task force, which is why I'm banging on about it and plugging it. But keep an eye out for that. It's very important for these sorts of issues.
Trista?
Yeah, I think just to add, especially echoing what Sophia mentioned, that on one hand, Asian company can perceive a reluctant because they are, the margin comparison is 5% to 50%. That really speaks about how much pressure they actually would take should the carbon price come up to be much more expensive than what is on the market if there is a system, right? But on the other hand, we also noticed that the trend of the companies, the maturity, when you engage them about climate topic have changed significantly. They don't see this as a resistance. They actually welcome investors to advise and share what are the other peers are doing in developed market. They see this more like opportunity to either entering a new market and then also to really make commitment of their decarbonization strategy, right? So I would say that it will be a trend that we see quite rapid pick it up rather than resisting, saying that this won't be like a financial burden, where we see across perhaps more on the opportunity side, so glass half full, yeah.
We have time for one more question, and I see a hand there.
Oh, hi, Xin Ting from State Street Global Advisors. So I'm actually based in Melbourne, so another Australian, so we like to ask questions. So a very brief question in terms of, listening to the presentation and the discussion about fragmented carbon market. So I guess my question is whether you guys have seen there's any arbitrage opportunity for the companies to choose where they're going to, in terms of future location of their operations. There's one question. Then another follow-up is whether there's any convergence in the carbon pricing coming up in the future, whether the government is willing to talk to each other to make it a more coordinated approach.
Go ahead.
So very quickly, I think the great arbitrage opportunity from carbon leakage has passed. That's the story of manufacturing moving to Asia, essentially. And obviously the CBAM is a direct response to that, and expect other jurisdictions to introduce CBAMs. And of course, it's already having an impact and will have a significant impact on exporters here over time, even if they don't do anything about it. And even if Asian jurisdictions don't introduce carbon pricing, they will be affected by the CBAMs. So at the margin, there might be opportunities for arbitrage, but I think that structural opportunity has been eroded. I can't remember the second bit of your question. So apologies. Oh, and the great driver of convergence, in a sense, will be the CBAM. Actually, that will help drive convergence, and will be a force that we haven't had in the system before. But I'm a bit skeptical about the idea that we're going to have a single global carbon price, or even connected across continents. These sorts of things. It's going to be fragmented. So and I think one of the arguments that people sometimes use is, oh well, we don't need to worry about this until there's a single global carbon price, or yes, it's going to be messy, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about it. It's already material now. It's going to become increasingly material.
I think also just in the Australian context with the safeguards mechanism that's been passed, they're also sort of thinking about implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So we're going to see that translating to most markets that are implementing a very ambitious sort of carbon pricing framework, and it will affect most markets as well. So I think that's about all the time that we have, unfortunately, for this session. But we will sort of kickstart dinner and drinks right now, and that will be a great a time to sort of engage with our panelists during dinner and drinks, and continue the conversations there. I think just before ending the session, I just want to note that these conversations that we are sort of having on carbon pricing and policy frameworks to implement more ambitious action on climate will continue beyond this sort of session, and this is just a Kickstarter for this whole conversation on carbon pricing, and we will engage in different markets in this. I just also wanted to sort of highlight that later on this year, AIGCC will be engaging with the Korean government on climate finance policy in November. We will also be engaging in Beijing on the sidelines of the ISSB World Meeting in the week of November 17th. And then we will also be at COP this year, sort of highlighting some of the areas of policy engagement that I highlighted earlier. So physical risks, more ambition on climate action in terms of mitigation. And so these conversations will continue, and I encourage all of you to sort of reach out to my team members here today to learn more about what we're doing. And with that, I invite all of you to join us for dinner. I would sort of also request that everyone keeps their translation device on the table, and then just head for dinner. It's really great to have all of you joining us, and thank you so much to the panelists as well for all of your insightful remarks. It's been wonderful. Thank you.